Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. Jake Wilson squinted against the glare of the morning sun as he stepped onto the weathered dock in Tofino, Vancouver Island. The salty breeze ruffled his short brown hair, carrying with it the promise of another day on the Pacific. At 32, Jake had spent nearly a decade as a hydrophone technician, but the thrill of diving into the ocean's depths never diminished. "Morning, Jake," called out Captain Mike from the wheelhouse of the research vessel, the Soundwave. "Ready for another swim with the fishes?" Jake grinned, hefting his equipment bag onto his shoulder. "Always, Cap. Any word on the conditions today?" Mike's weathered face creased with a smile. "Clear as a bell out there. Should be smooth sailing for your maintenance run." As Jake made his way down the dock, he noticed Dr. Sarah Chen, the project's lead marine biologist, poring over a stack of papers near the gangplank. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she barely looked up as Jake approached. "Morning, Sarah. What's got you so engrossed?" Jake asked, pausing beside her. Sarah glanced up, her eyes brightening with excitement. "Jake, perfect timing. I was just reviewing the latest Orca tracking data. There's been increased activity in the area over the past week." Jake felt a twinge of anticipation. In all his years of diving, he'd never had a close encounter with an orca. "Really? Any concerns for the dive today?" Sarah shook her head, but her expression turned serious. "Not necessarily, but it's always good to be aware. The pod we've been monitoring, that we call them the Clayoquot Sound Clan, has been spotted about 10 miles offshore. They shouldn't interfere with your work, but keep your eyes open, okay?" Jake nodded, absorbing the information. "Will do. Any specific behaviors I should watch out for?" Sarah tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her enthusiasm for the subject evident. "Well, this pod is known for their curiosity. If they do come near, don't panic. They're intelligent and generally not aggressive towards humans. But remember, they're apex predators, so always maintain respect and caution." "Got it," Jake replied, making a mental note. "I'll be sure to give them a wide berth if I spot any." As they boarded the Soundwave, Jake couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The possibility of seeing orcas up close was thrilling, but he knew better than to let his guard down in their domain. Once on board, Jake headed to the stern to double-check his diving gear. He meticulously inspected his wetsuit for any tears or weak spots, knowing that the frigid Pacific waters would be unforgiving of any oversight. His fingers moved deftly over the regulators and gauges of his air tank, ensuring everything was in perfect working order. "How's it looking?" asked Lisa, the team's diving safety officer, as she approached. Jake gave her a thumbs up. "All systems go. Just doing a final check on the hydrophone repair kit." He opened the waterproof case containing the specialized tools and replacement parts for the underwater acoustic monitoring system. The array of hydrophones they maintained was crucial for tracking marine mammal movements and studying underwater noise pollution. Today's dive was a routine check and repair mission, but Jake knew from experience that even the simplest tasks could become complicated beneath the waves. As the Soundwave chugged out of the harbor, Jake joined the rest of the crew for a final briefing. Captain Mike spread out a map on the deck pointing to their destination. "We'll be heading to Station 7, about 5 miles off the coast," Mike explained, his finger tracing the route. "Jake, you'll be dropping down to about 150 feet. The faulty hydrophone is located here." He tapped a spot on the map, "on the western edge of the array." Dr. Chen chimed in, her voice tinged with a mix of scientific curiosity and caution. "Remember, Jake, we've picked up some unusual vocalizations from that area over the past few days. It could be nothing, but stay alert down there." Jake nodded, feeling a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. "Any idea what might be causing them?" Sarah shrugged, her brow furrowed. "Hard to say without clearer recordings. That's part of why this repair is so important. Once we get that hydrophone back online, we'll have a better picture of what's happening down there." As the briefing concluded, Jake began his final preparations. He slipped into his wetsuit, the neoprene clinging to his skin like a second layer. Each piece of equipment he attached felt like another link to safety. His weight belt, buoyancy compensator, fins, and finally, the bulky air tank. Lisa approached, clipboard in hand, to conduct the pre-dive safety check. "Communications check," she said, tapping Jake's full-face mask. Jake adjusted the mask and gave a thumbs up. "Radio check, 1212, he spoke clearly into the integrated microphone. "Loud and clear," Lisa confirmed, making a note on her checklist. "Remember, maintain constant communication with the surface. Any issues, any at all, you call it in immediately." "Understood," Jake replied, his voice slightly muffled by the mask as the sound wave slowed to a stop over the dive site. Jake felt the familiar mix of anticipation and focus settling over him. He waddled to the edge of the boat, his movements awkward under the weight of his gear. Captain Mike's voice crackled over the radio. "Jake, you're clear to dive. Good luck down there, son." With a final check of his gauges, Jake took a deep breath and stepped off the boat. The world transformed as he plunged into the Pacific. The sun-dappled surface gave way to a realm of blue-green mystery. Jake allowed himself a moment to acclimate, controlling his breathing as he began his descent. The water grew darker and colder as he dropped deeper. At 50 feet, he paused to equalize the pressure in his ears. The beam of his dive light cut through, the gloom illuminating particles drifting in the water column. At 100 feet, the true isolation of the underwater world set in. The surface was a distant memory, and the seafloor was still shrouded in darkness below. Jake's training kicked in, keeping his breathing steady and his mind focused on the task at hand. Finally, at 150 feet, his fins brushed against the sandy bottom. Jake oriented himself, sweeping his light back and forth until he spotted the metallic glint of the hydrophone array. He swam towards it with practiced ease, unclipping the repair kit from his belt. As he neared the faulty hydrophone, a faint sound caught his attention. It was barely perceptible at first, a low vibration more felt than heard. Jake paused, hovering in the water as he strained to listen. The sound grew clearer, a haunting, melodic series of clicks and whistles. With a jolt of realization, Jake recognized the vocalizations. Orcas. They were distant but unmistakable. His heart raced with a mixture of awe and apprehension. He knew he should focus on the repair, but the scientist in him couldn't resist the urge to investigate further. Jake reached for the hydrophone, intending to adjust its sensitivity to better capture the Orca calls. As his gloved fingers touched the device, a surge of feedback screeched through his masked speakers. He recoiled, startled by the sudden noise. In his haste to silence the painful sound, Jake's elbow bumped against the hydrophone's control panel. The screech cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, Jake floated there, his breath loud in his ears as he tried to process what had happened. Then, faintly at first, but growing stronger, he heard it. The Orca calls were back, but different, distorted, amplified. With dawning horror, Jake realized his mistake. He had accidentally activated the hydrophone's broadcast function, pumping the altered Orca vocalizations back into the surrounding waters at many times their original volume. As the unnatural sounds echoed through the deep, Jake felt a primal fear grip him. He knew with chilling certainty that he had just shattered the peaceful equilibrium of this underwater realm. And somewhere out there in the vast blue, the Clayoquot Sound Clan was listening. Jake's heart pounded as he frantically worked to shut off the hydrophone's broadcast function. His fingers, clumsy in thick neoprene gloves, fumbled with the control panel. The distorted Orca calls continued to pulse through the water, an alien cacophony that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. "Surface, this is Jake," he called into his mask's radio, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "We have a situation down here." Dr. Chen's voice crackled back, tinged with concern. "Go ahead, Jake. What's happening?" Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to speak slowly and clearly. "I've accidentally activated the hydrophone's broadcast function. It's amplifying and distorting some Orca vocalizations I picked up. I can't seem to shut it off." There was a moment of tense silence before Sarah responded. "Okay, Jake, stay calm. Can you describe exactly what you're hearing?" As Jake opened his mouth to reply, a new sound cut through the water. Low and resonant, it vibrated through his body, setting his teeth on edge. This wasn't coming from the hydrophone. "Oh God," Jake whispered, his eyes wide as he swung his dive light in a wide arc. "Sarah, I think I think they're here. Who's there, Jake? Sarah's voice was sharp with urgency. The Orcas, Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I can hear them. They're close. In the control room of the Soundwave, Dr. Chen exchanged a worried glance with Captain Mike. She leaned closer to the radio, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the console. Jake, listen to me carefully, Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. You need to stop trying to fix the hydrophone and start ascending immediately. Slow and steady, remember your training. We're going to bring you up. Jake nodded, forgetting for a moment that they couldn't see him. Understood. I'm starting my ascent now. He gave the malfunctioning hydrophone one last frustrated look before kicking off from the seafloor. As he began to rise, the water around him seemed to vibrate with increasing intensity. The Orca vocalizations were getting louder, more varied. Clicks, whistles, and pulsed calls blended together in a symphony that was both beautiful and terrifying. At 130 feet, Jake saw the first shadow. A massive, streamlined form glided past the edge of his vision. There and gone so quickly, he almost thought he'd imagined it. But then, another appeared, closer this time, and another. Surface, Jake called, his voice tight with fear. Visual. Confirmation on Orcas. Multiple individuals, they're circling me. On the boat, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah grabbed a hydrophone and dropped it over the side, plugging it into a speaker system. The haunting calls of the Orcas filled the cabin, underscored by a rhythmic clicking that grew steadily faster. Echolocation, Sarah murmured, her face pale. They're scanning him. Captain Mike leaned in, his weathered face creased with worry. Doc, what are they doing? I've never seen Orcas act like this around a diver. Sarah shook her head, her eyes never leaving the depth gauge that showed Jake's painfully slow ascent. I don't know. The amplified calls from the broken hydrophone, they must have interpreted it as some kind of challenge or distress call. They're agitated, curious, possibly aggressive. She keyed the radio again. Jake, can you give us a count? How many Orcas do you see? Underwater, Jake was living a scene straight out of his deepest nightmares. The Orcas were no longer content to circle at a distance. They were drawing closer with each pass, their massive bodies blocking out what little ambient light penetrated. This deep. I count at least 5, Jake reported, his voice shaking. Maybe more. They're getting closer. Sarah, what do I do? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, thinking furiously. When she spoke, her voice was calm but urgent. Jake, listen carefully. Do not make any sudden movements. Try to make yourself as non-threatening as possible. If you can, turn off your dive light. The brightness might be agitating them. Jake's hand shook as he reached for the switch on his light. As darkness enveloped him, he felt a moment of pure, primal terror. He was blind, suspended in an alien world, surrounded by some of the ocean's most intelligent and powerful predators. Lights off, he whispered into the radio. I'm at 110 feet now, still ascending. The next few minutes were the longest of Jake's life. He focused on his breathing, trying to stay calm as he felt rather than saw the Orcas moving around him. Their calls seemed to come from every direction, a disorientating chorus that made it impossible to track their movements. Suddenly, Jake felt a rush of water against his side. Something large had just swept past him, so close he could have reached out and touched it. He flinched, letting out an involuntary gasp. Something just buzzed me, he reported, his voice tight. Very close pass. On the surface, Sarah and the crew listened in helpless tension. The hydrophone picked up a series of rapid clicks, followed by a long, low call. They're communicating, Sarah said, her scientific curiosity warring with her concern for Jake. Coordinating. But I don't understand. This isn't normal hunting behavior. As if in response to her words, Jake's panicked voice burst from the speakers. They're herding me. Oh God, they're not letting me ascend. Sarah grabbed the radio. Jake, what's happening? Every time I try to go up, one of them blocks me, Jake gasped. They're keeping me down here. I'm running out of air. The crew exchanged horrified glances. Captain Mike swore under his breath, already moving towards the diving gear. We've got to get him out of there. Sarah grabbed his arm. Mike, no, you can't go down there. You just be putting yourself in danger too. So what do we do? Mike demanded. We can't just leave him down there. Sarah turned back to the radio, her mind racing. Jake, I need you to stay calm. Remember, orcas are intelligent and curious. They're probably trying to figure out what you are. We need to convince them you're not a threat or prey. Underwater, Jake was nearing his breaking point. Every direction he turned, he met the solid bulk of an orca body. They weren't attacking, but their relentless circling and herding was pushing him to the edge of panic. How? He pleaded. How do I do that? Sarah took a deep breath. Okay, Jake. I want you to start talking to them. What? Jake's voice was incredulous despite his fear. Orcas communicate vocally. They're probably picking up your panicked breathing and racing heartbeat. Talk to them calmly. Let them hear your voice. It might help them recognize you as a sentient being rather than a potential prey item. Jake wanted to argue, to point out how insane this sounded, but he was out of options. Surrounded by tons of curious, powerful marine life, he began to speak. Hey there, he said, feeling slightly ridiculous. I'm Jake. I'm not food, okay? Not a seal or a whale or whatever else you might think I am. Just a guy who took a wrong turn and ended up in your neighborhood. To his astonishment, the circling orcas seemed to slow. He felt a shift in the water as one passed close by, but it didn't try to hurt him this time. Encouraged, Jake continued. That's right, just a visitor. Not here to cause any trouble. In fact, I was just leaving. So if you fine folks could just let me swim on up to my boat, I'd really appreciate it. The orca calls changed, becoming softer, almost inquisitive. Jake felt movement above him and looked up to see the orcas parting, creating a path towards the surface. It's working, he breathed into the radio. They're letting me through. Sarah's relief was palpable. Great job, Jake. Keep talking and start ascending. Nice and slow. Jake continued his one-sided conversation with the orcas as he swam upwards. They followed, but at a distance now, their movements more curious than threatening. As he passed 60 feet, Jake began to make out the hull of the sound wave above him. I see the boat, he reported. Almost there. The last 30 feet of the ascent seemed to take an eternity. Jake's lungs burned, his air supply dangerously low. But finally, mercifully, he broke the surface. Hands reached down, pulling him aboard. As the crew helped him out of his gear, Jake turned to look back at the water. 7 tall dorsal fins sliced through the waves, circling the boat once before turning and disappearing into the depths. Jake slumped to the deck, exhausted and shaken. Sarah knelt beside him, her face a mix of concern and barely contained excitement. Jake, she said softly, what you just experienced, it's unprecedented. Are you okay? Jake looked at her, then at the now calm sea where the orcas had vanished. A laugh bubbled up from his chest, half hysteria and half wonder. Okay, he repeated. I just had a conversation with a pod of orcas. I don't think I'll ever be just okay. Again. As the sound wave turned back towards shore, Jake knew his life had changed forever. The ocean, which he thought he knew so well, had just revealed a new depth of mystery and intelligence. And somewhere out there, the Clayoquot Sound Clan swam on, carrying with them the memory of the strange creature they'd encountered in the deep. Jake's hands trembled as he clutched a steaming mug of coffee, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the Pacific met the sky. The Soundwave's engine thrummed beneath his feet as they made their way back to Tofino Harbor. The events of the past hour felt surreal, like a vivid nightmare he couldn't quite shake off. Dr. Chen sat beside him, her notebook open on her lap, pen poised. Jake, she said gently, I know you're shaken, but I need you to tell me everything you remember. Every detail could be crucial. Jake took a deep breath, the coffee's warmth spreading through his still chilled body. It all happened so fast, he began, his voice hoarse. 1 minute I was working on the hydrophone, the next I was surrounded. Sarah nodded encouragingly. Start from the beginning. What did you see first? Jake closed his eyes, recalling the moment. Shadows, just at the edge of my vision. I thought I was imagining things at first, you know. But then they got closer, and I could make out their shapes. God, Sarah, they were massive. How many did you count in total? Sarah pressed, scribbling furiously. At least 7, Jake replied, his eyes snapping open. Maybe more. They moved so fast, circling me, it was hard to keep track. Captain Mike, who had been listening from the wheelhouse, chimed in. 7's a good-sized pod, Probably a matriarch, maybe a couple of adult males, some juveniles. Sarah nodded in agreement. The Clayoquot Sound clan. We've been tracking them for years, but this is unprecedented behavior. Jake took another sip of coffee, willing his hands to stop shaking. They herded me, Sarah, like I was a school of fish or something. Every time I tried to swim up, one of them would cut me off. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with a mix of scientific curiosity and concern. And you said you talked to them? Jake let out a shaky laugh. Yeah, I guess I did. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? I mean, I know orcas are intelligent, but I never thought... It's not crazy at all, Sarah interrupted. Orcas are highly social creatures with complex communication systems. They've been known to mimic other sounds, even human speech in captivity. But direct interaction like this in the wild, it's extraordinary. As they continued to discuss the encounter, the sound wave entered Tofino Harbor. The familiar sight of the town's colorful buildings and bustling docks did little to settle Jake's nerves. If anything, the return to normalcy made the underwater encounter seem even more surreal. As they tied up at the research center's dock, Jake noticed a small crowd gathering. Word of the incident had clearly spread fast in the small coastal community. Among the onlookers, he spotted a familiar face. Linda Gray, the local newspaper reporter. Looks like we've got a welcoming committee, Captain Mike grunted as he cut the engine. Sarah squeezed Jake's shoulder reassuringly. You don't have to talk to anyone if you're not up for it. We can go straight to the debriefing room. Jake nodded gratefully, but as they disembarked, Linda pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Jake, Dr. Chen, can you confirm the rumors about an orca encounter? Was a diver attacked? Before Jake could respond, Sarah stepped in front of him. Linda, we've just returned from a complex research dive. We'll be issuing a full statement once we've had time to analyze the data. For now, all I can say is that there was an unexpected interaction with a pod of orcas, but no one was harmed. Linda's eyes gleamed with the scent of a story. But Jake looks pretty shaken up. Are you sure? That's enough, Linda, Captain Mike interrupted, his voice gruff but not unkind. The boy's been through a lot. Let him catch his breath before you start grilling him, eh? As they made their way through the crowd, Jake felt dozens of eyes on him. Whispers followed in their wake, snippets of orca attack and miracle survival reached his ears. He hunched his shoulders, suddenly feeling claustrophobic despite the open air. Inside the research center, the team gathered in the debriefing room. Maps of the coastal waters covered one wall, dotted with pins marking recent orca sightings. A large whiteboard dominated another, already filled with Sarah's hurried notes from their conversation on the boat. As Jake sank into a chair, the reality of what had happened began to truly sink in. He had come face to face with one of the ocean's apex predators, not just seen them, but interacted with them in a way few humans ever had. All right, let's break this down step by step, Sarah began, uncapping a marker. Jake, I want you to close your eyes and walk us through the encounter again. Every sight, every sound, every sensation. Jake complied, his voice growing steadier as he recounted the experience. He described the initial fear that gripped him when he realized he was surrounded, the awe at the orca's size and grace, the panic when they began herding him. And then, he continued, when I started talking to them, it was like something shifted. Their movements changed. They weren't as aggressive anymore. It felt more curious. Sarah nodded, jotting down notes. That tracks with what we know about orca behavior. They're incredibly intelligent and known for their curiosity. But this level of interaction with a human diver, it's unprecedented. Could it have been the malfunctioning hydrophone? Lisa, the diving safety officer, asked. Maybe the distorted calls confused them. Sarah tapped her pen thoughtfully against her chin. It's possible the amplified and distorted calls might have piqued their interest, but that doesn't fully explain their behavior once they found Jake. As the team continued to dissect the encounter, Jake found his mind wandering. He recalled the moment when the largest orca, the one he assumed was the matriarch, had swum directly over him. For a brief instant, their eyes had met, and Jake had felt something, a connection, an understanding that defied explanation. Jake? Sarah's voice snapped him back to the present. You look like you just thought of something. Jake hesitated, unsure how to articulate what he had felt. I I don't know if this makes any sense, but when I looked into their eyes, it was like they were trying to communicate. Not just through sounds, but I don't know. It felt like they were trying to understand me as much as I was trying to understand them. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Jake's words hanging in the air. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft but intense. Jake, what you're describing, it could revolutionize our understanding of Orca cognition and interspecies communication. Captain Mike leaned forward, his weathered face creased with concern. That's all well and good, Doc, but what does this mean for our operations? We can't have divers getting surrounded by curious orcas every time we go out there. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the valid concern. You're right, Mike. We'll need to revise our safety protocols. But more importantly, we need to understand why this happened. Was it a one-time occurrence triggered by the hydrophone malfunction? Or could this be the beginning of a new pattern of behavior? As the team continued to discuss the implications of the encounter, Jake found himself torn between excitement and trepidation. Part of him longed to get back in the water, to experience that connection again. But another part recoiled at the memory of being surrounded, helpless, in the vast blue depths. Jake, Sarah said, noticing his conflicted expression, I know this has been an overwhelming experience, but I want you to know that what happened today, it's the kind of thing marine biologists dream about. You've opened up a whole new avenue of research. Jake managed a small smile. Thanks, Sarah. I can't stop thinking about them, about what they were trying to tell me. Sarah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. And that's exactly what we're going to try to figure out. If you're up for it, I'd like you to work with our team to develop a more detailed analysis of the orcas' vocalizations and behavior during the encounter. For the first time since surfacing, Jake felt a spark of excitement cut through his lingering fear. You mean try to decipher what they were saying? Sarah nodded. Essentially, yes. We'll combine your first-hand experience with our existing data on Orca communication. It's a long shot, but who knows? We might be on the verge of cracking the code of Orca language. As the meeting wound down and the team began to disperse, Jake remained in his seat, staring at the map of Orca sightings on the wall. Somewhere out there, the Clayoquot Sound Clan was swimming, hunting, communicating. And now, in some small way, he felt connected to them. Captain Mike paused by Jake's chair on his way out, placing a calloused hand on his shoulder. You did good out there today, son. Not everyone could have kept their cool like that. Jake looked up at the old sailor, gratitude in his eyes. Thanks, Cap. I'm not sure I did keep my cool, but I'm glad I made it back. Mike squeezed his shoulder. That you did. And let me tell you something. I've been sailing these waters for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of strange things. But what you experienced today, that's something special. Don't let the fear of it overshadow the wonder. As Mike left, Jake turned back to the map, his eyes tracing the patterns of orca movements along the coast. The captain was right. Beneath the lingering fear and shock, there was a sense of wonder growing. He had touched the unknown, communed with one of the ocean's greatest mysteries, and somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that this was only the beginning. The following days passed in a blur of debriefings, medical checkups, and near-constant analysis of the encounter. Data. Jake found himself at the center of a whirlwind of scientific excitement and media attention. The research center had been flooded with calls from marine biology departments across the globe, all eager to learn more about the unprecedented Orca interaction. On the third morning after the incident, Jake sat in the center's acoustics lab, headphones clamped over his ears as he listened to the hydrophone recordings for what felt like the 100th time. The haunting calls of the orcas filled his ears, sending shivers down his spine despite the familiar surroundings. Dr. Chen entered the lab, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. She set one down beside Jake, who nodded gratefully without removing his headphones. Any progress? Sarah asked as Jake finally pulled off the headset. He shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. I don't know, Sarah. I keep listening, hoping I'll suddenly understand what they were saying, but it's just noise to me. Sarah smiled sympathetically. Don't be too hard on yourself, Jake. We're trying to decipher a language that's evolved over millions of years. It's not going to happen overnight. Jake took a sip of coffee, wincing at the bitter taste. I know, it's just, when I was down there, surrounded by them, it felt like I was on the verge of understanding something profound. Now, back here, it all seems so distant. Sarah leaned against the desk, her eyes bright with the enthusiasm that had driven her. Research for years. That's why we need to get you back in the water. Jake nearly choked on his coffee. What? Sarah, you can't be serious. I'm dead serious, she replied. Look, Jake, what you experienced out there was extraordinary, but it was also unplanned and potentially dangerous. If we want to truly understand what happened and possibly replicate that level of interaction, we need to do it under controlled conditions. Jake set down his mug, his hands shaking slightly. The memory of being surrounded by tons of sleek, powerful marine life was still vivid in his mind. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he admitted quietly. Sarah's expression softened. I understand, Jake, really, I do. But think about what this could mean for our research, for our understanding of Orca intelligence and communication. We're on the brink of something revolutionary here. Before Jake could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. Captain Mike burst into the lab, his weathered face creased with excitement. They're back, he announced breathlessly. The Clayoquot Sound Clan. They've been spotted just a few miles offshore. Sarah's eyes widened. Are you sure it's the same pod? Mike nodded. Positive, we've got visual confirmation on the matriarch, it's them all right. Jake felt his heart rate quicken. The Orcas were back, so close to where they had encountered him. Was it coincidence or something more? Sarah turned to Jake, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. Jake, I know I was just talking about getting you back in the water, but I didn't mean this soon. However, this might be our best chance to observe any changes in their behavior post-interaction. Jake stood up, his decision made almost before he realized it. I'll do it, he said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. But we do this carefully, all right? I'm not eager to become Orca Chow. The next hour was a flurry of activity as the team prepared for an emergency research expedition. Jake found himself once again donning his wetsuit, each piece of equipment feeling heavier than he remembered. As the sound wave cut through the waves, Jake stood at the bow, his eyes scanning the horizon. The memory of his last dive loomed large. In his mind, a potent mix of terror and wonder that set his nerves on edge. Sarah joined him, her hair whipping in the wind. We'll be dropping you at the edge of their current location, she explained. You'll have a cage for protection this time, and we'll be monitoring everything from up here. If anything feels off, even for a second, you give the signal and we'll pull you up immediately. Jake nodded, his throat too dry for words. As they neared the coordinates, the crew began preparing the dive cage. It was a sturdy metal structure designed to protect divers during shark observations. Jake had never imagined he'd be using one for orcas. As he climbed into the cage, Captain Mike approached, handing him an underwater tablet. We've loaded this with some of the orca vocalizations we recorded during your last encounter, he explained. Thought it might come in handy if you need to, strike up a conversation. Despite his nerves, Jake couldn't help but chuckle. Thanks, Cap. Here's hoping they're in the mood for a chat. The cage was lowered slowly into the water, Jake's heart pounding in time with the winch's mechanical whine. As the Pacific enveloped him, he forced himself to take deep, calming breaths. The water was clearer than during his last dive, visibility extending for what seemed like miles in every direction. For several long minutes, there was nothing but blue. Jake began to wonder if the orcas had moved on, if this entire risky endeavor had been for nothing. Then he saw it, a flash of black and white in the distance. Visual contact, he reported into his radio. At least one orca about 100 yards out, moving closer. Sarah's voice crackled in his ear. Copy that, Jake. Remember, you're safe in the cage. Just observe and record as much as you can. The orca drew closer, its movements smooth and deliberate. As it neared, Jake realized with a start that he recognized it. The distinct pattern of its saddle patch marked it as the matriarch he had encountered before. She circled the cage slowly, her eye rolling to regard Jake with what he could have sworn was recognition. Jake's hand shook as he reached for the tablet, pulling up one of the recorded vocalizations. The sound that emanated from the device was a series of clicks and whistles, a greeting, according to Sarah's best guess. The effect on the orca was immediate. She stopped her circling, hanging motionless in the water, as she emitted a response, a longer, more complex series of sounds. "Sarah!" Jake called, his voice tight with excitement. "Are you getting this?" Loud. "Hand clear," came the response. Jake, this is incredible. She's directly engaging with the recording." As if in response to Sarah's words, more orcas appeared, gliding out of the blue to join their matriarch. Soon Jake found himself surrounded once again, but this time the fear was overshadowed by a sense of awe and privilege. The orcas began to vocalize in earnest, a symphony of clicks, whistles, and pulsed calls that reverberated through the water. Jake played more of the recorded sounds, eliciting what seemed like responses from the pod. Time lost all meaning as Jake floated in his cage, enveloped in a world of cetacean communication. He observed behaviors he had never seen documented, synchronized movements that appeared almost choreographed, exchanges of vocalizations that seemed like conversations. At one point, the matriarch approached the cage closely, her eye level with Jake's. In that moment, Jake felt the same connection he had experienced during their first encounter, a sense of mutual curiosity and intelligence that transcended species barriers. Slowly, reluctantly, Jake became aware of Sarah's voice in his ear, calling him back to the surface. The dive had lasted over an hour, though it felt like mere minutes to Jake. As the cage was winched up, the orcas followed, their dorsal fins breaking the surface around the boat. They remained nearby as Jake was helped aboard, their presence a testament to the extraordinary encounter that had just taken place. On deck, Jake was met with a buzz of excitement. Sarah enveloped him in a hug, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Jake," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "what you've just done. It's going to change everything we thought we knew about orca intelligence and interspecies communication." Captain Mike clapped him on the back, his gruff exterior softened by wonder. "I've been sailing these waters for 4 decades, he said, shaking his head in amazement. "Never thought I'd see anything like this." As the sound wave began its journey, back to port, Jake stood at the rail watching the orca's dorsal fins slice through the waves alongside them. The fear that had gripped him earlier was gone, replaced by a profound sense of connection and purpose. He realized that his life had been irrevocably changed by these encounters. The mystery of orca communication now burned within him, a puzzle he was determined to solve. And as he watched the magnificent creatures swimming freely in their ocean home, Jake knew that he was no longer just an observer of the marine world. He had become a bridge between 2 species, standing at the frontier of a new era of understanding. Between humans and one of the ocean's most intelligent inhabitants, the journey ahead would be challenging, filled with unknowns and potential dangers. But as the coast of Vancouver Island came into view, Jake felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, guided by the haunting calls of the orcas and the promise of discoveries yet to come. The research center buzzed with excitement in the days following Jake's second encounter with the Clayoquot Sound Clan. Scientists from around the world had flown in to analyze the data, and the air was thick with speculation and theories. Jake found himself at the center of it all, recounting his experience over and over to wide-eyed researchers and skeptical veterans alike. On a crisp morning, a week after the dive, Jake sat in the main conference room, surrounded by holographic displays of orca vocalizations and behavior patterns. Dr. Chen stood at the front, addressing the assembled team. "What we've witnessed is unprecedented," Sarah began, her voice brimming with contained excitement. "The level of interaction between Jake and the orcas suggests a degree of interspecies communication we've only dreamed of before. But we need to proceed carefully. We can't risk anthropomorphizing their behavior or jumping to conclusions." A visiting behaviorist from New Zealand, Dr. Amelia Tate, spoke up. "I agree, Sarah. While the footage is compelling, we need to consider alternative explanations. Could the orcas simply be displaying curiosity towards an unfamiliar object in their environment?" Jake felt a flare of defensiveness. "It was more than curiosity," he insisted, leaning forward. "There was a connection, especially with the matriarch. When our eyes met, it was like she was trying to tell me something." Dr. Tate offered a sympathetic smile. "I understand how it felt, Jake, but feelings aren't data. We need to approach this scientifically." Before Jake could retort, Captain Mike, who had been quietly observing from the back, cleared his throat. "Now, I'm no scientist," he began, his gruff voice cutting through the tension, "but I've been sailing these waters for 40 years. I've seen orcas plenty of times, and what I saw out there, that wasn't just curiosity. Those animals were communicating." A murmur ran through the room. Sarah nodded, acknowledging both perspectives. "This is exactly why we need to plan our next steps carefully. We have an opportunity here to potentially revolutionize our understanding of cetacean intelligence. But we also have a responsibility to these animals and to scientific integrity." As the meeting continued, Jake found his mind wandering. He remembered the feeling of being surrounded by the orcas, their sleek bodies gliding through the water with effortless grace. He recalled the complex vocalizations, the way the pod had seemed to respond to the recorded sounds. There was something there, he was sure of it. Something beyond mere scientific observation. Later that afternoon, Jake escaped the confines of the research center, needing some fresh air and space to think. He found himself walking along the rocky shoreline, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, a soothing counterpoint to the cacophony of theories and debates he'd left behind. As he rounded a bend, he spotted a familiar figure perched on a large driftwood log, Linda Gray, the local reporter. She waved as he approached, patting the log beside her in invitation. "Fancy meeting you here, Jake," Linda said as he sat down. "Escaping the madhouse?" Jake chuckled ruefully. "Is it that obvious?" Linda shrugged, her keen eyes studying him. "It's big news, what you've experienced. Everyone wants a piece of it. How are you holding up?" Jake was silent for a moment, watching the waves. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Part of me is excited, you know? We might be on the verge of something huge. But another part is overwhelmed." Linda finished for him. When Jake nodded, she continued, "That's understandable. You've gone from being a hydrophone tech to the center of a potential scientific breakthrough. That's a lot of pressure." "It's not just that," Jake admitted, surprising himself with his candor. I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something. Everyone's so focused on analyzing the data, breaking down every click and whistle. But when I was in the water, with them it felt like more than that. I don't know how to describe it." Linda leaned forward, her reporter's instincts kicking in. "Try," she encouraged gently. Jake took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "It was like, have you ever had a conversation with someone who doesn't speak your language, where you're relying on gestures and facial expressions, trying to convey meaning beyond words?" Linda nodded and Jake continued. "It was like that, but more. When I looked into the matriarch's eye, I felt understood, like she was seeing me, really seeing me, not just as some strange creature in her environment, but as an equal, I guess. Someone she could communicate with." Linda was quiet for a moment, absorbing Jake's words. "That's quite something, Jake. Have you shared these feelings with the research team?" Jake laughed, but there was little humor in it. "I've tried, but you should have seen their faces. They want data, measurements, things they can quantify." "How do you quantify a feeling of connection?" As they sat in companionable silence, a commotion further down the beach caught their attention. A small crowd had gathered at the water's edge, pointing out to sea. Jake stood, shielding his eyes against the glare of the setting sun, his breath caught in his throat. There, just beyond the breakers, a large dorsal fin cut through the waves. As he watched, more fins appeared. The Clayoquot Sound clan, so close to shore it was almost unheard of. Without thinking, Jake found himself moving towards the water, drawn by an inexplicable urge to be closer to the orcas. He heard Linda calling his name, but it seemed distant, unimportant. As he waded into the shallows, the cold Pacific water shocking against his skin, the orcas drew nearer. The crowd on the beach had grown, their excited voices carrying over the sound of the surf. Jake barely noticed them. His entire focus was on the approaching pod. The matriarch's distinctive fin was easy to spot. She led the others, coming so close to shore that Jake feared she might beach herself. But she stopped just short of the breakers, her massive body rolling slightly to bring her eye above the water's surface. In that moment, as their gazes met once again, Jake felt the same profound connection he had experienced underwater. But this time, something was different. There was an urgency in the orca's gaze, a sense of purpose that sent a shiver down Jake's spine that had nothing to do with the cold water. A series of clicks and whistles reached his ears, complex and melodic. Without the barrier of the dive, mask and hundreds of feet of water, the vocalizations were even more haunting, more meaningful. Jake found himself responding instinctively, a wordless vocalization rising from deep in his chest. To his astonishment, the orca seemed to react to his call. She emitted a long, low sound that vibrated through the water, felt as much as heard. The rest of the pod joined in, creating a symphony of cetacean communication that left the onlookers on the beach in awe. As suddenly as they had appeared, the orcas began to move away, their fins receding into the distance. Jake stood rooted to the spot, the water now up to his chest, his mind reeling from what had just transpired. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sarah standing beside him, her eyes wide with wonder. "Jake," she breathed. "What just happened?" Jake shook his head, struggling to find words. I think they were trying to tell us something, Sarah. Something important." As they made their way back to shore, surrounded by excited onlookers and a barrage of questions, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random encounter. The orcas had sought him out, had come to him. But why? Back at the research center, as he sat wrapped in a warm blanket, recounting the experience to the assembled team, Jake made a decision. This wasn't just about scientific observation anymore. It wasn't about data points or peer-reviewed papers. Something was happening here, something that defied conventional scientific understanding. "We need to go back out there," he announced, cutting through the excited chatter, "not just to observe, but to listen, really listen. They're trying to communicate with us, I'm sure of it, and I think I might be able to understand them." The room fell silent, all eyes on Jake. He met their gazes steadily, the certainty of his conviction evident in his voice. "I know how it sounds, but after what just happened on that beach, can any of you honestly say this is just normal animal behavior?" Sarah stepped forward, her expression a mix of scientific caution and barely contained excitement. "Jake's right. What we're dealing with here goes beyond our current understanding. We need to approach this with open minds and open hearts." As the team began to plan their next move, Jake stood by the window, looking out at the darkening ocean. Somewhere out there, the Clayoquot Sound clan was swimming, living their complex lives in a world humans had only begun to understand. And they had reached out, bridging the gap between species in a way that defied explanation. Whatever came next, Jake knew his life had been irrevocably changed. He was no longer just an observer of the marine world. He had become something more, a translator, a bridge between two intelligent species sharing the same blue planet. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with potential dangers and incredible discoveries. But as he watched the last light fade from the sky, Jake felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, guided by the haunting calls of the orcas and the promise of a deeper understanding of the ocean's greatest mysteries. The pre-dawn sky was a canvas of deep purples and blues as the sound wave cut through the choppy waters off Vancouver Island. Jake stood at the bow, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of dorsal fins. The events of the past few weeks had led to this moment, a dedicated expedition to seek out the Clayoquot Sound clan and attempt deliberate communication. Dr. Chen approached, handing Jake a steaming mug of coffee. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the drone of the engines and the slap of waves against the hull. Jake took a sip before answering, the bitter warmth a welcome contrast to the crisp morning air. "Nervous, excited, terrified," he admitted with a wry smile. "Take your pick." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "All perfectly natural reactions, considering what we're attempting here." She paused, studying Jake's face. "You know, it's not too late to change your mind. We could still do this from the safety of the boat." Jake shook his head firmly. "No. If we're going to do this, really do this, I need to be in the water with them. It's the only way." Before Sarah could respond, Captain Mike's gruff voice crackled over the ship's intercom. "Orca sighting 2 o'clock. Looks like we've found our pod." The deck erupted into a flurry of activity as the research team rushed to their stations. Jake felt his heart rate quicken as he spotted the telltale black fins slicing through the waves. This was it. As the crew prepared the dive cage, Dr. Amelia Tate approached Jake, her face a mask of professional concern. "Jake, I know you're convinced about this connection you feel with the orcas, but I urge you to maintain scientific objectivity. We can't allow personal feelings to cloud our judgment." Jake bristled slightly, but kept his voice level. "With all due respect, Dr. Tate, I think we're dealing with something here that goes beyond traditional scientific parameters. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts." Amelia opened her mouth to argue further, but Sarah intervened. "We've discussed this, Amelia. We're proceeding with Jake's approach, but with all possible safety precautions in place." She turned to Jake. "Speaking of which, it's time to gear up." As Jake donned his wetsuit and checked his equipment, he couldn't shake a feeling of anticipation that went beyond normal pre-dive jitters. Something was going to happen today. He could feel it in his bones. The cage was lowered slowly into the water, Jake's breath fogging his mask as he descended into the cool depths of the Pacific. As the blue enveloped him, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. This was where he belonged. "Comms check, Jake," Sarah's voice crackled in his ear. "How are you doing down there?" "I'm good," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the surrounding water. "No sign of the pod yet, but wait." He broke off as a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. "Contact. I've got at least one orca approaching from the east." The shadow resolved into the sleek form of an orca, its black and white coloration stark against the blue of the ocean. Jake recognized her immediately, the matriarch. She approached the cage with deliberate slowness, her eye rolling to regard Jake with what he could only describe as recognition. "Hello again," Jake said softly, though he knew she couldn't hear his words through the mask. Instead, he reached for the underwater speaker they had brought, loaded with recordings of orca vocalizations. As the sounds played out into the water, the effect was immediate. The matriarch stopped her approach, hanging motionless in the water as she emitted a series of clicks and whistles in response. "Sarah, are you getting this?" Jake asked excitedly. "Loud and clear," came the response. "The vocalizations seem similar to what we recorded during your last encounter, but there are some variations. We're analyzing them now." More orcas appeared, emerging from the blue to join their matriarch. Soon, Jake found himself surrounded once again by the pod, their massive bodies dwarfing his cage. But this time there was no fear, only a sense of awe and anticipation. What happened next would be debated in scientific circles for years to come. The orcas began to vocalize in earnest, a complex symphony of clicks, whistles, and pulsed calls that seemed to ebb and flow like a conversation, and Jake, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain, found himself responding. He mimicked their sounds as best he could, using his voice and body in ways he never had before. He felt rather than heard the vibrations of his attempts travel through the water, and to his amazement, the orcas seemed to react, adjusting their own vocalizations in response. "Jake, what's happening? Your vitals are spiking." Sarah's concerned voice cut through his concentration. "I'm fine," Jake assured her, though fine didn't begin to cover what he was feeling. "Sarah, I think we're communicating." "Really?" Communicating. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Jake and the orcas engaged in this unprecedented exchange. There were no words, no clear meanings he could articulate. But there was a sense of connection, of mutual understanding that transcended language. Suddenly, the matriarch broke away from the group, swimming with purpose towards the open ocean. She turned back, emitting a series of sharp clicks that seemed almost like an invitation. "They want us to follow them," Jake said, certainty in his voice. "Jake, no." Sarah's response was immediate. "It's too risky, we can't just—" "Sarah," Jake interrupted, a note of urgency in his voice. "Trust me, this is what we've been working towards. They're trying to show us something." There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of Jake's breathing and the distant calls of the waiting orcas. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Okay, but we follow at a safe distance with the boat. You stay in the cage. At the first sign of trouble, we pull you up. Understood?" "Understood," Jake agreed, relief flooding through him. What followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The sound wave followed the pod as they led them further out to sea, Jake suspended in his cage beneath the boat, serving as a translator between species. As they traveled, the orca's behavior became increasingly agitated. Their vocalizations took on a different tone. Urgent, almost distressed, Jake relayed his impressions to the team above, struggling to put into words what he was sensing. "It's like they're trying to warn us about something," he explained, frustration evident in his voice. "Or show us something, I can't quite—" His words were cut off as the matriarch suddenly dove, the rest of the pod following suit. Jake watched in awe as they descended, disappearing into the depths. "They're diving deep," he reported. "Really deep. Can we follow?" "Negative," Captain Mike's voice came over the radio. "We're not equipped for those depths. We'll have to wait for them to resurface." Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Jake strained his eyes, searching the blue for any sign of the returning pod. When they finally reappeared, his breath caught in his throat. The orcas burst from the depths with explosive force, their bodies gleaming in the sunlight. But it was what followed them that caused Jake's heart to race. In their wake, a plume of dark, murky water rose to the surface, spreading out like an oil slick. "Sarah," Jake called, his voice tight with alarm. "Are you seeing this?" "We see it," Sarah confirmed, her tone grim. "We're taking samples now, but Jake, this doesn't look good." As the full implications of what the orcas had shown them began to sink in, Jake felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Awe at the intelligence and altruism the orcas had displayed, pride at having been able to facilitate this communication. But overriding it all was a deep sense of dread. The orcas circled the boat, their calls taking on a mournful quality that needed no translation. They had brought humans to this spot for a reason, had trusted Jake to understand their message, and that message was clear. Something was very wrong in their ocean home. As the sound wave began the journey back to shore, samples of the polluted water secure in the lab, Jake remained in the cage, watching the pod swim alongside them. The matriarch approached one last time, her eye meeting Jake's in a gaze that seemed to hold volumes of unspoken communication. In that moment, Jake knew that his life's path had been irrevocably altered. He had become more than just a hydrophone technician, more than a marine researcher. He had become a bridge between two worlds, entrusted with a vital message from the depths of the ocean. As the coast of Vancouver Island appeared on the horizon, Jake made a silent vow. He would not let the orcas down. Whatever it took, he would make sure their warning was heard and heeded. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter had now become a mission, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about. The ocean, about orcas, and about the relationship between humans and the natural world. The Clayoquot Sound Clan had placed their trust in him, and Jake was determined to prove worthy of that trust, no matter where it might lead him. The Soundwaves lab was a hive of activity as scientists pored over the water samples collected from the site the orcas had led them to. Jake paced the small space, his wetsuit still dripping on the floor, unable to shake the sense of urgency that had gripped him since their return. Dr. Chen hunched over a microscope, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is troubling," she muttered almost to herself. "What is it, Sarah?" Jake asked, moving closer. "What did they show us?" Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with worry. "It's a complex mixture of pollutants, heavy metals, microplastics, and something else, something I can't quite identify." Dr. Tate joined them, her earlier skepticism replaced by grim determination. "I've just gotten off the phone with the Environmental Protection Agency. They're sending a team, but it could take days for them to arrive and set up a proper investigation." Jake shook his head vehemently. "Days? We don't have days. You saw how urgent the orcas were. Whatever this is, it's serious." Captain Mike, who had been quietly observing from the corner, spoke up. "The boy's right. I've sailed these waters for 4 decades, and I've never seen the orcas behave like that. They were trying to tell us something, and I reckon we owe it to them to listen." Sarah nodded slowly, her scientific caution warring with the undeniable evidence of what they'd witnessed. "Okay, so what do you suggest, Jake? We can't exactly interview the orcas." Jake paused, an idea forming. "Maybe we can, not with words, but—" "Sarah, remember how they responded to the recordings we played? What if we could expand on that? Create a more complex system of communication?" Dr. Tate looked skeptical. That's a bit of a leap, don't you think? We're talking about cross-species communication on a level that's never been achieved before. Exactly, Jake said, his excitement growing. We've already established a basic level of understanding with them. They trusted us enough to show us this environmental threat. What if we could build on that? Create a sort of Orca-human dictionary? The room fell silent as the implications of Jake's suggestion sank in. It was Captain Mike who broke the silence, a chuckle rumbling from his chest. Well, I'll be damned. When I signed up for this job, I never thought I'd be teaching orcas to speak English. Sarah's eyes lit up with the spark of scientific possibility. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. We already have a database of orca vocalizations and their associated behaviors. If we could correlate specific sounds with specific concepts or objects, we could potentially ask them for more information about the pollution source, Jake finished, nodding enthusiastically. Dr. Tate still looked uncertain. It's an intriguing idea, but how would we even begin to implement something like this? Jake moved to the whiteboard, uncapping a marker. We start with the basics, simple concepts that we know the orcas understand. Food, danger, family. We create a set of human vocalizations or hand signals for each one, then pair them with the corresponding orca sounds. As Jake sketched out his ideas, the energy in the room shifted. Even Dr. Tate leaned in, her scientific curiosity overcoming her initial skepticism. We'd need to set up a series of controlled experiments, Sarah mused, her mind already racing with possibilities. Maybe use underwater speakers to broadcast the paired sounds, observe their reactions. And we'd need to find a way to record and analyze their responses in real time, Dr. Tate added, warming to the idea despite herself. Captain Mike cleared his throat. All this science talk is well and good, but aren't we forgetting something? Those orcas led us to that polluted area for a reason. Shouldn't we be focusing on cleaning it up? Jake turned to the captain, determination in his eyes. You're absolutely right, Cap. But think about it. If we can establish this communication, we might be able to get more information about the source of the pollution. Maybe even find out if there are other affected areas we don't know about yet. Sarah nodded in agreement. Jake's right. The more information we have, the more effectively we can address the problem. And in the meantime, we can alert the authorities and get the cleanup process started with what we already know. As the team continued to brainstorm, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a scientific endeavor now. It was a mission to protect the orcas and their ocean home, guided by the very creatures they were trying to save. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The research center became the headquarters for what the team had dubbed Project Rosetta, named after the ancient stone that had helped decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. Jake found himself at the center of it all, working tirelessly to develop the communication system. He spent hours in the underwater observation pod, attempting to mimic orca vocalizations and observing their responses. Each small breakthrough, each moment of apparent understanding, fueled his determination. One evening, as the sun dipped below, the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Jake stood on the observation deck, lost in thought. The beauty of the scene before him was a stark reminder of what was at stake. Sarah joined him, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Jake sighed, taking a sip of the bitter brew. I can't shake this feeling of responsibility, you know? These orcas, they reached out to us. They trusted us. What if we can't live up to that trust? Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Jake, what we're attempting here, it's unprecedented. The fact that we're even trying is remarkable. And we're making progress, even if it's slower than we'd like. Jake nodded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. I know, it's just, every day we spend working on this communication system is another day that pollution is spreading. What if we're too late? We can't think like that, Sarah said firmly. We're doing everything we can. The EPA has already started preliminary cleanup operations based on our findings, and our work here could have implications far beyond this one incident. Imagine being able to communicate with orcas all over the world to understand their needs and protect their habitats more effectively. Jake managed a small smile. When you put it like that, it does sound pretty amazing. Their conversation was interrupted by an excited shout from the lab. Dr. Tate burst onto the deck, her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly. "We've had a breakthrough." Jake and Sarah exchanged a look before hurrying after her. In the lab, a group of researchers huddled around a computer screen, watching a video with rapt attention. The screen in Orca, the matriarch, Jake realized with a start, was responding to a series of underwater sounds broadcast from the research boat. As each sound played, she responded with a specific vocalization or movement. "We've established a consistent pattern," Dr. Tate explained. Her earlier skepticism completely evaporated. "Look here. When we play the sound we've designated for danger, she makes this specific call and points her body in the direction of the polluted area we found." Jake leaned in, his heart racing. "And these other responses?" "We think this one might mean food," Sarah said, pointing to another sequence. "And this. We believe it might be their way of referring to their pod, or maybe family in general." Jake felt a surge of emotion, joy, excitement, and a deep sense of connection to these incredible creatures. This is amazing. We're actually doing it. We're talking to them." Captain Mike, who had been silently watching from the back of the room, spoke up. "So what's our next move? How do we use this to help them?" Jake straightened up, a plan already forming in his mind. "We go back out there. We use what we've learned to ask them more specific questions about the pollution, its source, its extent, anything that can help us fight it more effectively." Sarah nodded in agreement. "I'll start making the arrangements. We'll need to modify our equipment, prepare a new set of sounds based on what we've learned." As the team sprang into action, Jake felt a renewed sense of hope. They were on the brink of something extraordinary, not just a scientific breakthrough, but a new way of connecting with the natural world. That night, as he lay in his bunk listening to the sound of waves against the hull, Jake thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. From a routine dive gone wrong to the cusp of interspecies communication, it was more than he could have ever imagined. But with that excitement came a sobering realization of the responsibility they now bore. The Orcas had reached out, had chosen to communicate with humans in a way never before seen. It was up to Jake and his team to prove worthy of that trust, to use this newfound understanding to protect the Orcas and their ocean home. As he drifted off to sleep, Jake's dreams were filled with the haunting calls of Orcas, no longer alien and unknowable, but carrying messages he was finally beginning to understand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries. But for now, in the quiet of the night, Jake allowed himself to marvel at the bridge they were building between two worlds, and the possibilities that lay ahead. The sound wave cut through the early morning mist, its bow slicing the calm waters, as it headed towards the coordinates, where they had last encountered the Clayoquot Sound clan. Jake stood at the railing, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of dorsal fins. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air. Dr. Chen approached, handing Jake a steaming mug of coffee. "Big day," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "How are you feeling?" Jake took a sip, letting the warmth spread through him. "Like we're about to make history," he replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "Or fall flat on our faces. Maybe both." Sarah chuckled, but her eyes were serious. "Jake, I need you to remember something. No matter what happens out there today, what we've already accomplished is extraordinary. We've established a basic form of communication with another species. That's huge." Jake nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I know. It's just, I can't shake this feeling that they're counting on us, Sarah, the Orcas. They reached out to us for a reason." Before Sarah could respond, Captain Mike's voice crackled over the intercom. "Orca pod sighted off the starboard bow. Looks like our friends have been waiting for us." The deck erupted into a flurry of activity as the research team rushed to their stations. Jake felt his heart rate quicken as he spotted the telltale black fins slicing through the waves. This was it. As the crew prepared the underwater communication equipment, Dr. Tate approached Jake, her face a mask of professional focus. "Remember the protocol we discussed. We start with the established signals, then gradually introduce the new concepts. We need to be patient, methodical." Jake nodded, trying to quell the impatience he felt. "I understand." But if an opportunity presents itself, we follow the protocol, Dr. Tate insisted. We can't risk misunderstanding or misinterpretation. There's too much at stake. As Jake donned his wetsuit and checked his gear, he couldn't shake a feeling of anticipation that went beyond scientific curiosity. Something was going to happen today. He could feel it in his bones. The observation pod was lowered slowly into the water, Jake's breath fogging his mask as he descended into the cool depths of the Pacific. As the blue enveloped him, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. This was where he belonged. "Comms check, Jake." Sarah's voice crackled in his ear. "How are you doing down there?" "I'm good," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the surrounding water. "No sign of the pod yet, but wait." He broke off as a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. "Contact. The matriarch is approaching from the east." The sleek form of the Orca matriarch glided into view, her movements deliberate and graceful. She approached the pod with what Jake could only describe as purpose, her eye rolling to regard him with unmistakable recognition. Jake reached for the underwater speaker, loaded with the vocalizations they had carefully prepared. He began with the greeting signal they had established, a series of clicks and whistles that they believed communicated peaceful intentions. The response was immediate. The matriarch emitted a series of vocalizations that closely mimicked their greeting, before adding a complex series of clicks and calls that Jake recognized as the danger signal they had identified. "Sarah, are you getting this?" Jake asked excitedly. "She's responding to our greeting, and I think she's trying to tell us about the pollution again." "We're recording everything," Sarah confirmed, her voice tight with concentration. "Try the new sequence we prepared, the one asking for more specific information about the location." Jake complied, broadcasting a carefully constructed series of sounds that they hoped would convey the concept of where in relation to the danger they had previously identified. What happened next would be debated in scientific circles for years to come. The matriarch began to vocalize in a way Jake had never heard before, a complex symphony of clicks, whistles, and pulsed calls that seemed to ebb and flow like a conversation. And then, to Jake's utter astonishment, she began to move. The Orca swam in a deliberate pattern, circling the observation pod before heading off in a specific direction, then returning to repeat the process. "Sarah," Jake called, his voice filled with wonder. I think she's trying to give us directions." That's incredible," Sarah breathed. "Jake, can you mimic her movements? Show her you understand?" Jake maneuvered the pod, following the pattern the Orca had demonstrated. As he completed the sequence, the matriarch emitted a series of excited clicks that needed no translation. "I think we've got it," Jake reported, his heart racing. "She's leading us somewhere." What followed was an underwater journey unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The matriarch led the way, occasionally circling back to ensure the pod was following, while the rest of her clan flanked them protectively. As they traveled, Jake continued to broadcast the communication signals they had developed, receiving increasingly complex responses. It was as if, having established this basic level of understanding, the Orcas were eager to expand upon it. "Jake," Sarah's voice came through, a note of urgency in her tone. "We're approaching the edge of the continental shelf. The water's going to get much deeper. Are you sure about this?" Jake glanced at his depth gauge, realizing with a start how far they had come. "I'm sure," he replied, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "They want to show us something, Sarah. We have to trust them." As they passed over the shelf, the water beneath them dropped away into an inky blackness that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The Orcas dove deeper, and Jake followed, pushing the observation pod to its limits. Suddenly, the matriarch stopped, hovering in the water as she emitted a series of low, mournful calls. As Jake's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw what had caught her attention. "Oh my God," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, what is it?" Sarah's voice was tense with concern. It's a dump site," Jake replied, his voice shaking with a mixture of horror and anger. "There are barrels, dozens of them. Some have split open. Whatever was inside is leaking into the water." As the full implications of what the Orcas had shown them began to sink in, Jake felt a mix of emotions wash over him. awe at the intelligence and trust the Orcas had displayed, pride at having been able to follow their guidance. But overriding it all was a deep sense of rage at the careless destruction humans had wrought in this pristine environment. "Sarah, we need to document this. All of it. And we need to alert the authorities immediately. This is so much worse than we thought." As Jake began to capture footage of the underwater dumping ground, the Orcas circled the area, their calls taking on a mournful quality that needed no translation. They had brought humans to this spot, for a reason, had trusted Jake to understand their message. And that message was clear. Their home was under threat and they needed help. Hours later, as the sound wave began the journey back to shore, the mood on board was somber. The excitement of their communication breakthrough was tempered by the sobering reality of what they had discovered. Jake stood on the deck, watching the Orcas swim alongside the boat. The matriarch surfaced near him, her eye meeting his in a gaze that seemed to hold volumes of unspoken communication. Sarah joined him, her face etched with concern. "What you did today, Jake? It's revolutionary. We've not only established communication with another species, but we've used that communication to uncover an environmental crisis. The implications are staggering." Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving the Orca. "This is just the beginning, Sarah. They trusted us with this information. Now it's up to us to do something about it." As the coast of Vancouver Island appeared on the horizon, Jake made a silent vow. He would not let the Orcas down. Whatever it took, he would make sure their message was heard and heeded. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter had now become a mission, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the ocean, about Orcas, and about humanity's responsibility to the natural world. The Clayoquot Sound clan had placed their trust in him, had shared knowledge that could help save their ocean home, and Jake was determined to prove worthy of that trust, no matter where it might lead him. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jake felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything he had ever known. The bridge between species had been built. Now it was time to use it to make a difference. The Tofino Research Center buzzed with frantic energy as scientists, environmental officials, and media representatives swarmed the facility. The discovery of the underwater dump site had sent shockwaves through the scientific community and beyond. Jake found himself at the center of a storm, recounting the events of the past few weeks to an endless parade of wide-eyed listeners. "Mr. Wilson," a reporter from a national news network thrust a microphone towards him. "Can you describe what it was like to communicate with the Orcas?" Jake ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion etched on his face. "It was incredible, humbling. These are intelligent, sentient beings with a complex language of their own. They reached out to us, trusted us to understand their message. And that message led to the discovery of illegal dumping in protected waters," the reporter pressed. "How do you respond to critics who say this is all an elaborate hoax?" Jake felt a flare of anger. "I'd invite those critics to dive down there themselves and see the destruction firsthand. This isn't about publicity or grants. It's about protecting our oceans and the creatures who call them home." Dr. Chen stepped in, placing a calming hand on Jake's shoulder. "I think that's enough questions for now. We have a lot of work to do." As they moved away from the press gaggle, Sarah lowered her voice. "How are you holding up?" Jake sighed, the weight of the past few days evident in the slump of his shoulders. "I'm tired, Sarah, and frustrated. We should be out there cleaning." He left that site, not answering questions about whether or not Orcas can talk. Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I know, but what we've discovered, it's unprecedented. The scientific community needs time to process it, and the authorities need time to mobilize a proper cleanup operation." "Time we might not have," Jake muttered, his eyes drifting to the window overlooking the harbor. In the distance, he could see the dorsal fins of the Clayoquot Sound clan breaking the surface. They hadn't strayed far since leading the team to the dump site, as if standing guard over their human allies. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Captain Mike burst in, his weathered face flushed with excitement. "You need to see this," he said, gesturing for them to follow. They hurried after him to the observation deck. A crowd had gathered, all eyes fixed on the water. Jake pushed his way to the railing, his breath catching in his throat at the sight before him. The entire Clayoquot Sound clan was engaged in what could only be described as a synchronized display. They leapt from the water in perfect unison, their massive bodies gleaming in the sunlight, before crashing back into the waves with thunderous splashes. "My God," Sarah breathed beside him. "I've never seen anything like this." As they watched, the pattern of the orca's movements began to take on a familiar rhythm. Jake's eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're mimicking the communication signals we used. They're trying to talk to us." Dr. Tate, who had joined them on the deck, shook her head in disbelief. "That's impossible. The level of cognitive ability required to translate underwater vocalizations into above-water physical movements." "Look!" Jake interrupted, pointing to the matriarch. She had separated from the group and was now closer to shore, her movements deliberate and focused. The massive orca slapped her tail against the water in a distinct pattern, 3 quick slaps. A pause, 2 long slaps. Another pause, then a rapid series of slaps that sent water spraying into the air. Jake's mind raced, translating the pattern into the communication system they had developed. "Danger," he muttered. "Location. Urgent." He turned to Sarah, his eyes wide. "They're telling us there's another dump site." The deck erupted into a flurry of activity. Scientists rushed to set up recording equipment, while others hurried to prepare the research vessel for another expedition. Jake felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Linda Gray, the local reporter, who had been covering the story from the beginning. "Jake," she said, her voice low and urgent, "is it true? Are they really communicating?" He met her gaze, seeing the mixture of awe and skepticism in her eyes. "It's real, Linda. I know how it sounds, but they're intelligent, empathetic beings. They've seen what we're doing to their home, and they're asking for our help." Linda's professional demeanor softened. This is incredible, Jake. But you know what's coming, don't you? Once this gets out, it's going to change everything. For the Orcas, for this town, for you." Jake nodded, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "I know, but we don't have a choice. They trusted us with this knowledge. We have to act on it." As the team prepared for another expedition, Jake found himself drawn back to the railing, his eyes fixed on the matriarch. She had moved closer to shore, her massive body barely submerged in the shallow water. As he watched, she rolled to her side, her eye breaking the surface to meet his gaze. In that moment, Jake felt the same profound connection he had experienced underwater. There was an intelligence in that eye, a depth of understanding that transcended species barriers. And there was something else, a plea, an urgency that needed no translation. "I hear you," Jake said softly, knowing she couldn't possibly hear his words, but hoping somehow she would understand his intent. "We're coming. We'll make this right." Sarah appeared at his side, her face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "We're ready to go, Jake. The EPA has given us clearance to investigate the new site. Are you sure about this?" Jake tore his gaze away from the Orca, turning to face Sarah with newfound determination. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. They're counting on us, Sarah. We can't let them down." As they boarded the sound wave, Jake felt a shift in the air, a sense that they were standing on the precipice of something monumental. The bridge between species that had begun as a chance encounter had become a lifeline, not just for the Orcas, but for the entire marine ecosystem. The implications were staggering. If they could establish this level of communication with Orcas, what other secrets might the ocean's creatures be waiting to share? What other environmental crises might they help uncover and address? As the boat pulled away from the dock, the Clayoquot Sound clan fell into formation around them, a honor guard of sleek black and white bodies guiding them towards their destination. Jake stood at the bow, the salt spray on his face and the wind in his hair, feeling more alive than he ever had. This was more than a scientific expedition now. It was a partnership, a collaboration between species united in the goal of protecting their shared home. And as the coastline receded behind them and the vast expanse of the Pacific opened up before them, Jake knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The Orcas had given them a gift, a chance to see the ocean through their eyes, to understand the threats facing their world in a way no human observation could provide. Now it was up to Jake and his team to use that gift wisely, to be the voice for those who could not speak in human tongues, but whose message was more vital than ever. As the sound wave cut through the waves, guided by the silent signals of their cetacean allies, Jake felt a surge of hope. They faced an enormous challenge, a battle against ignorance, greed, and environmental destruction, but they did not face it alone. With the orcas as their partners, they had a chance to make a real difference, to heal the wounds inflicted on the ocean and forge a new path of coexistence and mutual understanding. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with potential dangers and incredible discoveries, but as Jake watched the orcas glide effortlessly through the water beside the boat, he knew that together they were equal to the task. The ocean's secrets were beginning to unveil themselves, and Jake was ready to listen, to learn, and to act. The autumn wind whipped across the deck of the Soundwave as it cut through the choppy waters of the Pacific. Jake Wilson stood at the bow, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the grey sky met the darker grey of the sea. 6 months had passed since the discovery of the illegal dump sites, 6 months of intense work, heated debates, and gradual progress. Penny, for your thoughts? Dr. Sarah Chen's voice cut through his reverie as she joined him at the railing, offering a steaming mug of coffee. Jake accepted it gratefully, wrapping his cold hands around the warmth. Just thinking about how much has changed, he replied, his voice barely audible over the wind and waves. Sometimes I still can't believe we're out here doing this. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From accidental communication to, well, whatever you want to call this. This was their latest expedition, a coordinated effort between the research team and the Clayoquot Sound clan to map and monitor the health of the orca's critical feeding grounds. It was a level of interspecies cooperation that would have seemed impossible just months ago. As if on cue, a sleek black dorsal fin broke the surface off the port side. The orca, they had named her Nova for the star-shaped mark on her saddle patch, was one of their most frequent collaborators. She slapped her tail against the water twice, then disappeared beneath the waves. She's signaling, Jake said, already moving towards the underwater communication array they had set up on deck. I think she's found something. Sarah followed, her scientific curiosity piqued. Remember, we're still testing the expanded vocabulary. Don't assume. I know, Jake cut her off, a hint of impatience in his tone. Follow the protocol. Verify all interpretations. I remember. He activated the hydrophone, listening intently to the series of clicks and whistles that emanated from the speaker. His brow furrowed in concentration as he mentally translated the sounds into the rudimentary language they had developed with the orcas. She's detected a large school of fish, Jake reported, his fingers flying over the keypad as he input the information into their mapping system. But there's something else. I think she's trying to tell us there's something wrong with them. Doctor. Amelia Tate, who had been monitoring the data from her station nearby, looked up sharply. Wrong how? Are we talking about a known pathogen or... Her words were cut off by a sudden commotion in the water. The surface erupted as dozens of orcas breached simultaneously, their massive bodies gleaming in the weak sunlight, before crashing back into the sea with tremendous force. My God, Sarah breathed, her eyes wide. I've never seen them do that before. Jake was already back at the communications array, broadcasting a series of inquiring whistles. The response was immediate, a cacophony of urgent vocalizations that set the hydrophone speakers buzzing with their intensity. They're agitated, Jake reported, his voice tight with concern. Whatever Nova found, it's got the whole pod worked. Up. We need to get eyes on it. Captain Mike's gruff voice crackled over the intercom. Deploying the ROV, stand by. Minutes that felt like hours ticked by as the team waited for the remotely operated vehicle to reach the depth where Nova had made her discovery. When the first images flickered onto the monitors, a collective gasp went up from the assembled scientists. The screen showed a massive school of herring, one of the orca's primary food sources, but something was terribly wrong. Many of the fish were swimming erratically, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. Others floated limply, clearly dead or dying. What the hell, Jake muttered, leaning in for a closer look. Sarah, are you seeing this? Dr. Chen was already pulling on gloves, preparing to collect samples as soon as the ROV retrieved them. I see it, but I don't believe it. This level of disruption in a wild population, it's unprecedented. As the team scrambled to gather data and specimens, Jake found his attention drawn back to the orcas. They had gathered around the sound wave, their sleek bodies forming a protective circle. The matriarch, the same one who had first led them to the dump sites, surfaced near the bow, her eye rolling to meet Jake's gaze. In that moment of connection, Jake felt a surge of emotion that transcended mere scientific curiosity. These incredible creatures had placed their trust in humans, had shared their knowledge and their world, and now, once again, they were sounding the alarm about a threat to their ecosystem. "We'll figure this out," Jake said softly, knowing the orca couldn't hear his words, but hoping somehow she would understand his intent. "I promise." Hours later, the mood in the Soundwaves lab was tense as the team pored over the preliminary data. Dr. Tate looked up from her microscope, her face pale. "It's some kind of neurotoxin," she reported. "Unlike anything I've ever seen before. It's affecting the fish's central nervous system, disrupting their motor functions." Sarah ran a hand through her hair, frustration evident in her voice. "But where is it coming from? We've cleaned up the dump sites, we've been monitoring water quality. How did we miss this?" Jake, who had been quietly studying the map of orca movements they'd compiled over the past months, suddenly straightened. "We've been looking in the wrong place," he said, his voice filled with dawning realization. "The orcas. They've been trying to tell us all along." He pointed to a series of marks on the map, each indicating a spot where the orcas had exhibited unusual behavior or vocalizations. "See this pattern? They've been circling this area for weeks, but we thought they were just establishing a new feeding ground. What if they were actually trying to warn us about something there?" Captain Mike leaned in, his weathered face creased with concern. "That's the edge of the continental shelf. Water gets real deep real fast out there. Perfect spot to dump something if you don't want it found." A heavy silence fell over the lab as the implications sank in. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice filled with grim determination. "We need to go back out there. Tonight. If there's another dump site, we need to find it before whatever's in those barrels spreads any further." As the team prepared for the midnight expedition, Jake found himself once again drawn to the deck. The sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars reflected in the dark waters below. The orcas were still there, their dorsal fins cutting through the gentle swells like silent sentinels. Linda Gray, the local reporter who had been covering their work from the beginning, approached quietly. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" she said, nodding towards the orcas. "Hard to believe there was a time when people hunted them for sport." Jake nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "We've come a long way, but we've still got so far to go." Linda studied him for a moment, her journalistic instincts picking up on the tension in his posture. "What aren't you telling me, Jake? What's really going on out there?" He turned to face her, weighing his words carefully. "We've found something. Linda, something bad. I can't give you details yet, but this could be bigger than the dump sites, bigger than anything we've dealt with so far." Linda's eyes widened slightly, but to her credit, she didn't immediately reach for her notepad. Instead, she placed a hand on Jake's arm, her voice softening. "Be careful out there, okay? What you and this team are doing, it's important. More important than most people realize." As Linda walked away, Jake turned back to the water. The matriarch had surfaced again, her massive body barely visible in the starlight. As their eyes met once more, Jake felt the familiar mix of awe and responsibility wash over him. "We're heading out again," he said softly. "Show us what you found. Help us make this right." As if in response, the matriarch slapped her tail against the water, sending up a spray that glittered in the starlight. Then, with a final look at Jake, she dove beneath the waves, ready to guide them towards whatever dark secret lurked in the depths. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for the long night ahead. Whatever they found out there, he knew it would change things, for the orcas, for the ocean, for all of them. But as he watched the Clayoquot Sound Clan gather around the sound wave, ready to embark on this joint mission, he felt a glimmer of hope. Humans and orcas, working together to protect their shared home. It was unprecedented, extraordinary, and absolutely vital. As the engines rumbled to life and the sound wave began to move, Jake allowed himself a small smile. They were writing a new chapter in the story of human-animal relations, one that just might help save the oceans. And as they sailed into the unknown, guided by the silent signals of their cetacean allies, Jake knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The bridge between species had been built. Now it was time to use it to make a real difference.